Good morning, and welcome to the session on From the Lab to the Living Room. I'm Jennifer Schenker, founder and editor-in-chief of The Innovator, a global publication about innovation. And it is my pleasure to introduce Harrison Lung, who is the Chief Strategy Officer for which is the started out life as the telephone company for the United Arab Emirates and has morphed into a global technology company that is now operational in 38 countries. And so, Harrison, first, welcome. And we have heard over the last couple of days here about some amazing innovations. As someone who's very grounded in the business world and who is in charge of investments for the company, what in your mind it is necessary to bring these innovations out of the lab into people's living rooms, not just in the developed world, but also in the developing world, to ensure that, these innovations will truly impact everyone?
Well, first of all, thank you, Jennifer, for getting the opportunity to speak to you and in front of the audience today. And I think first off, you might think about, as a telecom operator, or at least historically a traditional one, why would EN be at a conference like this? And I think the reason and one of the primary causes for that is as we evolve into a global technology company, knowing and owning the technology is super critical and important. Today, EN operates the telecom network of over 20 countries, from the most developed part of the world, such as the UAE. In fact, the technology advancement and innovation here is better than many places in the West, whether it's in the US and UK and other places. On the other side of the spectrum, we operate in markets like Pakistan and even in areas like Africa, where they're farther away in the technology adoption curve. So in fact, our operating footprint serves as a very interesting test bed for technology innovation on one side and also technology adoption, so across the full end of the spectrum. Maybe to answer your question specifically, Jennifer, the really key thing about bringing these technologies from what we call the lab to the living room is centered on three things. The first is really understanding what is the problem that we're trying to solve. There's a specific pain point, a particular need. We operate in both the digital consumer as well as the digital enterprise space. So what are we trying to solve? And is that pain point big enough? The second thing is then what is then the technology and the solution that will go solve it? In many cases, for example, we bring it about ChatGPT and AI, there's many different LLMs there. There's many different solutions out there. Which one is the best? And then the third is primarily on what I call the monetization and commercial model. While we can, in theory, think about different solutions from research and innovation perspective, to really deploy it in the market at scale for a publicly traded company like ourselves, it needs to be financially viable. And of course, we have certain initiatives in place that touches the nonprofit space to really bridge the digital divide, but the vast majority of it needs to be commercially viable. So those are, I think, from our side, three key areas that we must consider as we go through this journey.
Thank you, Harrison. So your company has been involved in the Edison Alliance, which is a World Economic Forum initiative to help close the digital divide. And that alliance has made a huge amount of progress, and I hope we can talk a little bit about that. But last week, actually earlier this week, the Tony Blair Institute came out with a new report that said in the last year, the United States has created more data center capacity than the rest of the world combined, excluding China. So now we risk a new type of digital divide. How do we ensure that, the people in places like the United Arab Emirates that are leapfrogging ahead, but also in countries where you also operate, like Afghanistan, that are lagging behind, how do we make sure that they benefit from these new technologies and no one gets left behind?
Yeah. So first of all, we're very privileged to be partners with the World Economic Forum and its Edison Alliance. It is one of the preeminent institutions globally, and they're one of our strategic partners. As you may know, the Edison Alliance promised from the years 2022 to 2025, so 3-year span, to improve the lives of 1 billion people. And our commitment to them is across 2 elements. First is because historically we are the telecom operator in the countries that I mentioned, we would provide the digital network and infrastructure for these countries. And in a way, that is really the basis of forming and overcoming any potential digital divide, because connectivity is a key for many of the solutions and services that ride on top. The second thing is, as we evolve into a global technology group, we also have investment assets in companies like StarsPlay, which is an OTT and content platform here in the region, to things like Careem, the super app, and hopefully everyone is using them, right, to order food and delivery, to things like EM Money and Weo Bank, our fintech assets. So a number of these technology solutions that we can also offer in these markets so that the citizens, the general public, and the consumers of these countries can access these digital services to bridge the digital divide. So it could be access to financial services, so financial inclusion. It could be things like, healthcare because of, where they're based. And it could be things like education. If you recall 3-4 years ago, as we were in the midst of COVID, this was critical. Many children across the world, whether it's developed or developing world, was studying at home. Can you imagine if you don't have the right connectivity, if you didn't have the right solutions and platform, how that, let's call it education path and journey can continue? It's impossible. So we're really privileged of that.
But, as critical as the connectivity angle is, AI going forward, AI will also be critical for, not just companies, but also at an individual level, if you want to be able to keep a pace with, your colleagues and the rest of the world. So how do you handle the rollout of new technologies in, like, say, a place like Afghanistan that maybe, doesn't have the electricity and the other things that are needed to deploy immediately?
Yeah. No, so for us, AI, I'll talk about AI first and then sort of the disparity of the markets. In terms of AI, it is the core of everything that we do. In fact, 2 years ago, and this is before the launch of ChatGPT, we devised and released our overall corporate strategy and group strategy. One of the pillars of that strategy is really about digitizing our operations. And this is where technologies like AI, automation, and others come into play. Because what we want to do is leverage these technology to offer better and superior customer experience and customer engagement, but also really transform the internal operations of our company. So when we look at AI, we look at it in many different dimensions. First is internally, what are the different use cases and domains across the companies that we can use it in? Whether it's automating some of the payroll processes, engaging with our customers, really focus on the internal operations of EN across the countries as well as the functions that we have. But more importantly, with EN being a technology conglomerate, we also see it as an opportunity to partner with the government entities, multinational companies, and others to support them in going through their overall AI and digital transformation. So in fact, we also have AI products and solutions that we sell and partner with these entities against within our EN Enterprise entity, which is a B2B ICT type company. In regards to your point about the technology adoption, you're absolutely correct. We have markets like the UAE where everything is very advanced and forward-leading. In fact, from mobile network perspective, we have the fastest 5G network globally. If you look at the fiber penetration, it is 99% here. Whereas even in the US, I think it's around 40, 50%. And the reason is we have such tight collaboration with the government, with the property developers, whereby when they're building out the different villas and condos, it's all pre-wired in across the entire footprint, right? Now, to your point, we also operate in places like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and even many places in Africa. And I think the notion of technology adoption is going to be different. because in those markets, they do not have the financial resources, or in some cases, the electricity to power it. The whole idea is what I call right speccing or right sourcing. Because in some cases, again, right, there's an example from a couple of years ago, when people didn't have electricity, what did they use? They actually used their cell phone and the light as a flashlight, right, to do homework, to cook, or whatever. And even if you look a little bit more advanced in the area of AI, there are so many LLMs out there. And the cost of use for each one is actually very different, because you have open source, you have proprietary, you have ChatGPT 4, 3.5. There's so many different versions. In fact, even outside of LLMs, there's this new technology called SLM, small language models, which also has a different cost to serve. So I think the whole idea is, depending on the problem that you're trying to solve, which is back to my first answer to you, what is the right technology solution? And I just gave you a plethora of them. Then that will link to a different financial outcome and economic model associated to it.
There's also a sustainability angle here too, in the sense that, even in the developed countries, there's a big push now to ensure that the use of new technologies like AI use less resources. In the current situation, they use a tremendous amount of energy. They also use a lot of water, and they contribute to emissions. So there's a lot of pressure on to make sure that the benefits actually outweigh any harm that is done to the environment. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, on like how do we ensure, because of course, if AI can help us solve climate change, and do many other things like discover drugs and cure diseases, we have to use it, right? But at the same time, I think there is big pressure now on any company using AI to look for ways to make it more sustainable, including doing things like you mentioned, using small language models, right?
It's actually quite interesting we're having this conversation, because we just had COP29 taking place pretty much at the same time. And with COP28, literally 12 months ago, right here in Dubai in the UAE. And as I mentioned about our AI strategic imperative, it being a core pillar, at the same time, we had actually also put sustainability as another one. We have a total of 4, and this is 2 of the 4. And when we look at sustainability, we actually look at it much more holistically. I think you had, Jennifer mentioned a lot of the elements of it. You talk about electricity, water, and whatnot. That to us is just the environment portion. When we look at sustainability, it also involves the social component. For example, how to use data in a proper way so that it's not going to be exposed to different potentially state agent, and you're protecting the data privacy of the people that you have the data on. We look at areas like in other areas of social. How do you build the community here and provide them with the educational tools potentially for the less fortunate? So our notion of sustainability is much broader, right? And when we look at that, we also see it as a tremendous opportunity. If you, again, back to your point about the environment, if you look at the TMT sector, the GHG emission of the TMT sector is only roughly 3 to 4%, low single digits. 96 to 97% of the overall emissions globally is in industries outside of the TMT. And this includes things like, travel, or, oil and gas, retail, banking, so on and so forth. So not only do we see the need for us to transform ourselves sustainably, and we have certain initiatives in place, including the net zero commitment that we made in 2030, 40, and 50 across our different parts of the footprint, and the transition plan towards that. We also see it as our role within the ecosystem to support other government entities as well as corporates to go through their journey. So in our B2B ICT business, we have sustainability as a service, which helps track and monitor these companies go through that journey as well.
So you mentioned a key word here, which is opportunity. And, some of the people here in the audience may be working on new science or technology that helps companies become more sustainable, or other inventions that, fit in. So tell us a little bit about where E&D is placing its bets, and then for companies that are still either, their invention is still in the lab or it's very early stage, Talk a little bit about, what they need to do to attract investment from a company like yours and be so-called corporate ready.
No, I think that's a very interesting question. In terms of, let's call it bets, there's, I would say, two broad areas. Today, we operate, as I mentioned, the telecom network in 20 countries, and our technology asset spans 38 countries. So we are one of the vehicles the UAE government uses as part of its global expansion. So we have plans and ideas to actually expand to many, many more countries. In fact, we're also the largest minority shareholder of Vodafone Group, and they span many more countries outside of the ones that we operate in because it's a minority, right? So that's one aspect. And for anyone thinking about getting investments or working with EN, is how does your solution map back to the countries that we operate in? In some cases, it could be one, like here in the UAE, if we're talking about like quantum compute, for example. And I think that has been one topic that has been at the forefront in this conference. Or in some cases, it could be some of the lower tech solutions that may not be relevant in the UAE because we have, mobile banking, UAE Pass and everything. But in countries where there's no single user identity or no, access to financial inclusion, it could be very relevant there, right? The other aspect of our growth is not just the geographical one. As I mentioned, we're transitioning from a regional telecom company to be a global technology company. Today, we're primarily focuses on the services and solution side with businesses in cybersecurity, in fintech, in content, and others. I think as we expand in this place, we may go higher and lower in the technology stack, lower into areas like data center, core tech, compute, and others. These could be areas that I think could be very interesting to us. And I think as we become a technology company, you need to own the tech. You cannot integrate the tech and you cannot just buy the tech. You need to own the tech. In fact, many of these digital services companies that I mentioned already, Kareem, Starsplay, and others, they each own and operate their own technology platform. And that is, in my mind, the critical and key IP and moat for them to really build and scale the businesses, both here in the UAE as well as across the footprint.
Earlier on, when you were mentioning the kind of new services and new areas you were looking into, one of them was data privacy. Is that an area of opportunity as well?
Absolutely. And we don't look at data privacy in and of itself. I think, there's sort of a technical angle to it. How do you ensure you have the right security postures in place, the right segmentation of the network, the right policy? And then the other side of data privacy is much more focused on policy and processes. And you mentioned the World Economic Forum. We're also a partner with the World Economic Forum on data and AI. In fact, we're members of the AI Governance Alliance, along with many other entities out there. The fact is, AI is such a new area that I don't think we have everything sorted through. It is going to be here to stay, AI is. But that being said, it's going to be 2 steps forward, 1 step backward as these things get sorted through. And while we transform into this global technology conglomerate, we understand this is a space we cannot do it alone. And as such, partnership, collaboration is a big part of that. So we actually partner with not just these global entities like the World Economic Forum, GSMA, as well as the United Nations and ITU, but also other technology companies like the Googles and the Amazons, the AWS and the Microsoft, because they all have slightly different technology solutions to solve a similar need. So I think the whole idea here is to collaborate and really push the agenda forward to really focus on data privacy, responsible AI, and other similar topics.
Interesting. And I think that what we're hearing here at the conference, and I know that it's going to be a topic of the talk at noon today with Oritz Kopp from the Stanford Center for Responsible Quantum, that many of the issues with AI are now also being discussed for quantum because data privacy will also be an issue there, as well as, how to mitigate the risks and ensure that the technology is implemented in a responsible way. So I think, in
a way, they're all somewhat all interlinked. Because I think you had brought up the point on the digital divide previously. There are markets and countries in the world that cannot afford the latest AI algorithm, that cannot afford, the data centers and the energy that comes along with it. Quantum is a similar thing, right? And then this is all interlinked, whereby at the end of the day, AI needs the underlying infrastructure, data center, quantum compute, GPUs, et cetera, to really enable it. Because otherwise, it's just a standalone technology.
So we've talked a lot about, the underlying infrastructure. Let's talk about another piece of the puzzle, which is, people skills. How do we ensure that business world and the general population have the skill sets to really be able to leverage these new technologies?
This is an all-encompassing program that our HR colleagues are really driving within EN. And we look at it in different, let's call it employee population and user population. On one end, you'll have senior executives such as myself, part of the top 10, 20, 30 people in the company. We ourselves needs to be conversant in the technology. Some, let's call it basic layer, but pretty broad, general management style. So we ourselves are going through this journey within each of our own professional development program. So that's sort of segment number one. Segment number two is there's a number of employees within the EM population where tomorrow their jobs will also be very different. You're talking about the data entry clerk. You're talking about the account payable specialist. Then the question for them is, how do you then help them upskill and reskill to areas where next job would exist, right? The third segment is there are a number of graduates that's being pumped into the market every year. So in fact, EN has an AI graduate program, particularly focused on our Emirati nationals, to really bring the fresh thinking and the latest and greatest as we sort of cycle through our own population set, right? By providing more innovative thinking, by having access to the management team, and things like that. And this is all just within our internal employee population. I think there's the fourth one is sort of outside of EN. With EN, within our place within the UAE ecosystem, we also partner with places like the Minister of AI, Ministry of Education, to provide these skill set in the broader community that we serve. So it could be, working with different schools. It could be for different segments of the population. And we work with not just ourselves, but also with our technology partners. In fact, as part of our collaboration with the United Nations Development Program, we're doing a pilot in Egypt, where the UNDP has a partnership with Coursera, which is the global leading educational technology platform, where for that country, we will provide free internet, free marketing communications for certain segments of the population, the underprivileged, women entrepreneurs, and fresh graduates, to provide them with these skill sets and certifications so that they can find the right professional opportunities, just to give you one example.
Fabulous. Okay, so as part of your job, you kind of oversee investments. How do companies that are coming from a science background and not the traditional, say, entrepreneur, VC-backed track, how could they engage with a company like yours? And do you engage with academia? How do you pick up signals for what's coming next? And then how do you fill that gap between what's in the lab and then what you're actually going to implement?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because I think that's also the basis of much of the conversation here. So first of all, we already have a number of collaborations in place with, I'll call more the traditional startup venture capital side, because we have a venture capital fund with 250 million asset under management. We have deployed capital, about half of it, to 15, 16 companies, ranging from, people with, 50 employees to like over 100 employees to a couple hundred employees, right? And we typically write check sizes of 5 to 20 million. So that engine is in place to look for those companies, to invest, to collaborate, and to help foster. On the flip side, to get into more of, let's call it the fundamental research, we also have a number of partnerships with educational institutions in place. These ranges from NYU Abu Dhabi, Khalifa University, and even the local AI university, MBZ UAI. In fact, our collaboration with MBZ UAI also signed the MOU about a year ago today. It's very all-encompassing. It ranges from understanding the research that they're doing to then see how we can deploy it, to areas like helping them incubate their businesses, from theory to an actual commercial viable product, to joint go-to-market of potentially some solutions that they have patents for already, to even areas like co-marketing and branding, right? So it's actually very all-encompassing. We're also very lucky and privileged to have a university like that in our ecosystem, actually in our backyard, that we can work with.
In your experience, what works in those situations and what doesn't?
Yeah. So I think what doesn't work is just treat it as an MOU and you sign it and you move on. I think what works is, I would say, three things. The first is you definitely need top of the house type of relationship. In fact, this MOU was signed by myself, and I report to our group CEO Hatem, along with the VP of corporate affairs, and he reports to Eric Xing, who's the president of the university, right? So you need that top-down sponsorship. I think the second thing is to also be a little bit agile, because when you start out in these new relationships, you actually do not know what works and what doesn't work. But I think there needs to be a mindset of saying, okay, we will work together. Let's put down on paper 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different ideas and really understand and have each of the different stakeholders come in and say, okay, this is what we're thinking, this is what you're thinking, and let that go through. In fact, there's going to be situations where those 10 ideas might only be executed for 3 to 4 of them. And that's fine. And be mindful of that and be agile on that. And I think the third thing is coming to what I call a win-win value proposition. Because at the end of the day, they are an educational institution, right? So their thesis is training students, getting, research funding, endowment grants, and really helping their students find new jobs. Ours is we're a corporate, right? We want access to the latest innovation. We want access to potentially the latest talent. As these students graduate, maybe they want to come for work for EN. We want viable businesses. So really putting that down on paper and compare notes and bring it to bear, I think will really bring a win-win relationship that can be sustainable and actually enduring between the two entities.
So if I understand you correctly, you're not looking at this through the same return on investment lens as you would like a company that already has raised a VC round, and now you realize that like the stuff that's in the lab may take a bit longer, and so there's a little bit more leeway there.
Yeah, I think one of the benefits of working for a company like EN is we're super long-term thinking. Despite us being a publicly traded company here in the local stock exchange, we are also majority owned by the UAE government, Emirates Investment Authority, 60%. So with that, we actually have a very much of a long-term mindset and understanding the different investments that we make, some of which are very much immediate. I buy this company because I will know I'm going to get a 6% dividend payout every quarter or every 6 months. Some of them, it's going to be 3 to 5 years, and some of them are 10. And I think as we transition from a telecom company, which traditionally is very risk averse, to a technology company, we also realize some of these longer term bets are not going to work out. In fact, when we started our VC fund 2 years ago, we very much put down on paper and said, guys, out of this 250 million, we probably invest in 20 to 30 companies on average. Let's expect 10% to be home runs, where you get 3, 4, 5x your money. A small handful of them, 20 to 30%, may break even, but maybe 50 or 60% would just, pardon my French, die and close down. And I think we went into that mindset into the situation with an open-mindedness to really articulate that both to our board. And we're very fortunate to have a board and shareholders that understand that also provide us the leeway and the appetite to make these investments.
I think you would agree that there is a different. I mean, the scenario that you depicted, where it's 50% or even more of the companies will die. That's kind of typical for VC, but with deep science and deep tech, it's more, and the runway needs to be longer. Yeah.
Absolutely, right? I was just using an example. By the way, even some of these VC investments could be 10 years. And some of these, deep research could be 10 or 20 years, right? For example, we're working with Nokia now on 6G research, which is many years away when we just deploy 5G. And I think we're fully cognizant of that. Now, also on the flip side, we also have a very rigorous and disciplined investment and governance framework. It's not like we'll tell a researcher, hey, we'll give you $10 million USD, come back in 20 years. There's going to be certain milestone, stage gates that we would understand what the latest on the research and the progress is. And in some cases, we'll say, hey, maybe we should reposition some of the investments. In some cases, we might say, let's continue down the path. Or in some cases, we might say, hey, I think we have something here. Now's the time to double down and let's increase the size of the investment, grow the lab, grow the research facilities and the capacity.
We have just under 10 minutes left. Do we have any questions from the audience for Harrison?
I just heard you talk about 6G, and I'm really, really interested in that. Could you just give a small brief?
It's still very early and much of it is confidential, right? I think if you look at 5G right now, many operators are still in the process of monetizing it because there's billions and billions of CapEx that's been invested. But in the absence of a monetization model, it's very tough. Because think about it, for most consumers, what does it give you? You can stream YouTube a little bit faster, right? You can play your online gaming a little bit better. Are you willing to pay more for it, right? One of the primarily monetization use cases that we've seen in 5G is actually for enterprises. I think UAE is actually a prime example. During GITEX, which is about a month ago, we saw flying taxis, auto-driving cars. You need really good uninterrupted connectivity for that. Because the last thing you want is you're in some autonomous taxi and it just stops in the middle of the road, right? In the middle of Sheikh Zayed Road. So that's not good. So we're actually working with a number of entities, one of which is public is ADNOC, where we're building private 5G network that will give them almost like a dedicated slice of the network, a swim lane, so that they get uninterrupted. For example, today here, we probably had thousands of people here. So there could be a world where your network might be a little bit jittery. With the private 5G network, you basically have not just VIP access, but VVIP access. On 6G, the technology will eventually come, right? But now the question is going to be, what's the use cases, what's going to do for you? And I think the jury is still out on that because we're still, as a business, really much focused on monetizing and commercializing 5G in our broader markets. I think UAE, we've done a good job, but in countries like Egypt, Pakistan, that still needs to be figured out.
So what advice would you give someone who's aspiring to be a tech leader?
That's a really good question. And I think that's for yourself. For somebody who aspiring to be a tech leader or sort of early in your career and journey, I think number one, be open-minded and ask lots of questions, right? I think being in a conference like this is fantastic. You get to meet a lot of different people from all walks of life, all with different skill sets. Be open-minded and learn from each one. I'm also very fortunate to get a lot of LinkedIn inbound messages, and I try to help as much as I can. The second one is I do think having some entrepreneurial experience is also helpful, right? And by the way, I also work for a corporate now. And the reason is when you work for an entrepreneurial type and setup, you're actually doing everything and anything, right? You're a jack of all trades. One day you're thinking of what's the next phase of the product. The next time you're trying to sell the product and then meeting payroll. Just being part of that entity will give you a lot of learning in a very accelerated amount of time. And then I think the third is global experience. I think being in UAE is also fantastic because we're very multicultural. But if you look at the world nowadays, there's of course always a broad fluctuation about globalization, localization, regionalization, what have you. But at the end of the day, despite what different political policies are in place, the people will still transport themselves across borders. So the ability to work with different people from different cultures, different languages, I think that would be fantastic as well. So those would be my three humble advice to you.
As we're starting to, do we have any other questions? We have time for maybe one more. If not, then I'm going to ask you, Harrison, if there's like one or two things that you would like people to take away from today's session, what would that be?
I think the key thing here is technologies like AI is going to be here to stay, right? be open-minded that we're going to sort ourselves out in terms of where is it going to be deployed, how is it going to be deployed, how much you get to pay. So really embrace these technology, both in your everyday lives. Just try out the different tools, right? In terms of, hey, been helping you write your emails, correcting your grammar, filing your, different documents in your folders. That would take place. And then also think about what are the opportunities it has in your everyday life. And I think that, maybe back to my point to this gentleman, could actually form new business ideas and viable commercial models. That could be the next Google or the next Amazon. So just really open-minded, curious, and intellectually hungry from that sense.
Well, with that, I'd like you to give a nice round of applause for Harrison. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.